This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
We break down Michigan's 2019 football schedule and ask what or who is next for Michigan basketball now that John Beilein has moved on to the NBA. That and more on this week's edition of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it. And a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace, and welcome to this week's edition of Michigan Podcast. So, not all that much going on, eh? Yeah, not so much. John Beilein shocked the world by deciding to head off to the NBA, so we'll take a look at his lasting legacy at Michigan and then ask what or who is next to run our basketball program. We'll have that conversation coming up later in this episode with Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor and my cohort at Wolverine Digest. But we begin by taking a look at Michigan's 2019 college football schedule. Some news and notes, some things to think about when you take a look at this slate. Number one, the toughest game, I think we kind of all know what that is. It's Ohio State on November the 30th. Now, this year it is in the Big House, but when you've beaten your most hated rival, well, please, that close-up of that face is horrifying. When you beat your most hated rival one time in 15 years, but who's counting? You take nothing, absolutely nothing for granted. My buddy Michael Spath mentioned last week that he really hopes Ohio State doesn't struggle in Ryan Day's first year because it'd be more meaningful to him to beat Ohio State if they were at their best. Yeah, I'll take beating Ohio State at their worst. I'll take beating Ohio State with an airborne measles contagion. I mean, I'll take beating Ohio State after an EMP turns out all the electricity in the greater Columbus area. I mean, at this point, by any means necessary, I'll take a win over Ohio State. So that is Michigan's toughest game. But what about Michigan's easiest game of 2019? I think this one is kind of self-evident as well. It's Rutgers. It's on September the 28th, and you're playing them at home. So name your score now. How about your best bet for college game day? This may surprise you, but since, Michigan-Ohio State is also rivalry weekend, there's other big games. But I think right now, mark it in cement, the Notre Dame game on October the 26th. That's looking like it could be a night game. Notre Dame hasn't been here since 2013, looking at future schedules. Who knows when they might return? So I think with the two winningest programs, the two biggest brands of all time in college football squaring off, one final time for the foreseeable future, College Game Day, count on it. They will be in Ann Arbor on October the 26th. What about double buys? Something to keep in mind with the earlier start this year, you have double buys. And I like when Michigan has their two. I mean, if you could have picked almost a perfect time for these two buys, Michigan got it. September the 14th, after they play Army, so you get a week to relax after you got cut blocked by their triple option all afternoon, and that's before you go to Wisconsin to play the Badgers in another game that could be a night game, and then November the 9th, after the Maryland game and before Michigan State, so you get 2 full weeks there to focus on your in-state rival. So when Michigan's double buys occur, pretty much at the perfect time in Michigan's schedule. Homecoming this year, though, will not be a cakewalk opponent. Iowa will likely be in the preseason top 25 when the season begins, and they are Michigan's homecoming opponent on October the 5th. But here's what that also means, if there's any Iowa fans watching. It also means that's going to be a day game. Michigan would have a night game for the homecoming game. A long time no see. Michigan plays at Illinois on October 12th. I had to triple check this because it didn't seem right, but it is. That's Michigan's first trip to Champaign since Brady Hoke's first season in 2011. Yikes. Long time coming. And we'll probably be bringing the beat down for that one. Michigan's most experienced opponents this year, if you look at their total production returning, Michigan's most experienced opponents are Army on September the 7th and Michigan State on November the 16th. Both of those teams bring back almost everybody from last season. For Army, that's good news. I mean, they won 11 games last year. For Michigan State, we'll see, because they were 7-6. The sandwich game. You know, the game that is sandwiched between an emotional game and right before you've got another one on deck. Try at Indiana on November the 23rd. That's right after Sparty. That's right before the game. And I don't have to remind you as a Michigan fan, yes, I remember the last time we lost to Indiana. It was a non-televised game. So I had to catch the highlights on SportsCenter. It was a non-televised game in Bloomington, Indiana in 1987. That's the year that Indiana and Bill Mallory played George Perlis and Michigan State for the right to go to the Rose Bowl. That's the last time. I believe now that Navy has ended the streak of futility against Notre Dame. I believe this is now the longest streak of futility between two opponents in the FBS, Indiana and Michigan. But, you know, Indiana has played Michigan tough the last few years. Last year's game was tough. The previous 2 years went into overtime, and now Michigan is playing a classic sandwich game in Bloomington, and you just don't walk in to Bloomington, Indiana, and expect to come out with a victory. Well, actually, most of the time you do. But I'm sure they will give Michigan their best, especially given where that game is situated. If you're looking for the game, look out! How about at Maryland on November the 2nd? That's right after what we expect to be a College Game Day primetime game against Notre Dame. And then you go on the road to sleepy College Park. I know under Jim Harbaugh so far in 4 meetings, Michigan they violated Maryland. I mean, those aren't even losses. If you combine the score, those are violations. I mean, like, you get arrested for things like that in certain settings, except for prison. Then it's a date. But that's what Michigan's done to Maryland the last few years. But now you're playing them on the road the week after a huge rivalry game against Notre Dame in prime time with College Game Day there. That could be your lookout game. What about your whiteout game? Michigan will be the whiteout game for Penn State this year. That's coming up on October the 19th. By the way, Michigan is 2-3 so far in Happy Valley for whiteout games. And I know there's this notion that Penn State just cannot be defeated in whiteout games, but you know, all time, they're only 7-7. They're only a 500 team all time when they declare this a whiteout game. And that brings us to one last notion. The preseason win total for Michigan football is 9.5, according to the odds makers. Are you taking the over or are you taking the under? We're going to find out a little bit later on when we look at the results of our Twitter poll. But when we come back, what's next? We look at the legacy and the departure of John Beilein, but now the future of Michigan basketball with our good friend Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor right after this. Back here on Michigan Podcast, and we are joined now by Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor. He also works with me over at WolverineDigest.com. Good to talk to you, Michael. Go Blue. How are you?
You know, guys, doing well. It's sunny and beautiful here in Michigan, and man, what a mood changer that can bring. Although it's been an interesting week to be a Michigan sports fan.
Indeed it has. So, the earth shook on Monday with a sports bomb that I think registered on the Richter scale and continues to be even a national story. And that's Michigan's basketball coach, John Beilein, abruptly leaving to go to the NBA's Cleveland Cavaliers. I want to look at this from three angles. Number one, his departure. Number two, his legacy, and then thirdly, the future, what the future of Michigan basketball could look like. But let's start with his departure. And there have been numerous national stories. Everybody from Tim Brando to Dan Wetzel have written about, the ongoing cesspool, the systemic cesspool that is college basketball, that John Beilein probably just reached his wit's end with that, saw one last chance to coach in the NBA, and that's why he hit the eject. How much of that do you think was a factor here, and just your overall thoughts on his departure, Michael?
You know what? I honestly think it was about 50%. The frustration with college basketball, and about maybe 50% on the opportunity that the NBA afforded him. I'll tell you something I heard today from someone I trust pretty well, and that was when, and it's all tied into Jordan Poole, Iggy Brzdakis, and Charles Matthews leaving. And when that happened, it reemphasized to John Beilein that this is not what I signed up for. That when I came to Michigan, I looked at a place that I could build a program. I could recruit a higher caliber player than I was at Richmond or Canisius or even West Virginia, but I could recruit a player that was going to be a 3 or 4 year player for us. Some people like John Teskey and Xavier Simpson, Derek Walton and Zach Irvin, Muhammad Ali Abdul-Rahman, that were going to stick around, that were going to help us build this program to something special. We'd never be rebuilding. We would just be reloading. And starting with Trey Burke, who stuck around for 2 years, and then Stauskas and Robinson and McGarry were all gone after 2 years. And you had, Wagner leave after 3 and Wilson leave after 1.5. And then you had, this most recent exodus. I think there was an epiphany moment where he just kind of said, God, why is this happening again? I keep on recruiting someone like Ignis that nobody even heard of. Roy Williams will go back to that game against North Carolina in November, where he didn't know the scout report because he'd never heard of Ignis Brzdakis. Mm-hmm. And Jordan Poole, who wasn't ready to go pro. I've long argued if a guy, it's his decision. If he wants to test the waters, if he wants to do it, it's his life. But we can all agree that Jordan Poole is not really ready to be an NBA player, and that he would be better served with another season in college. And yet here's John Beilein looking at the system. And so that started to push him, from everything that I've been told. And then the byproduct is he's going out there and trying to get a grad transfer. And he's got a perfect grad transfer lined up in Justin Pierce, the young man from William and Mary. And at the last minute, North Carolina swoops in and takes him away from Michigan. Mm-hmm. And it's another example of one guy playing by one set of rules, and that being John Beilein and maybe 15 to 20 coaches out there, and the rest of the coaches playing by another set of rules. He's agonizing over this. And then something that I heard today was, he decided, I need to go get myself another player for this class. And so he flew to Germany about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, to go see Franz Wagner, Moritz Wagner's younger brother. And apparently that did not sit well in the Beilein household. That John, the season comes to an end, the amount of effort and energy that he devotes to his team, to the program. He had the heart condition in the summer where he needed surgery and he had to miss the European trip. And it sounds like the idea that he had to jump on a plane and fly to Germany, and that these last couple of weeks where he should have been kind of sitting back and relaxing and and taking it easy and getting a little respite after a long season. He's instead been on the road recruiting every which way because he has unexpected holes to fill. And from what I've been told, that did not sit well with the Beilein family, that he's putting himself in such physical distress time and time again. And certainly the NBA will have its share of physical and emotional stresses, but there's greater breaks in there. There's the All-Star break. There's the entire off season will be afforded as an opportunity where he can actually step away from it. He doesn't have to build his roster. He'll have some input, but he doesn't have to spend time with the free agents. And so it sounds like all of that involved for the NCAA helped push him, and then maybe some of this health stuff gave him further reason to consider the NBA and the amount of money and the 5-year contract, and knowing that this is my last job. This is my last job, and if I make it in the NBA, terrific. I can compete for a championship perhaps. I have this last little bucket list item to check off, and if I don't make it in the NBA, then I can either retire forcibly or on your own in 3 or 4 years and walk away from the game and be completely satisfied that he did everything he needed to at every single level of basketball.
His legacy, Michael, what do you think it is?
Greatest coach in Michigan basketball history.
I agree.
I think it's that simple and it's that strong. And I've heard people compare, and maybe even it was your text to me that this was the Bo Schembechler of Michigan basketball, and I think that is incredibly accurate. This is a guy who took a program that had tradition and had pride, but had wandered into the desert and had seemingly spent 40 years in the abyss, just going from place to place, wondering when it was ever going to be back. And he's the one that restored the Block M. He restored Michigan. He restored that pride. He restored that championship. I mean, when Michigan basketball for the last 6-7 years could sing that the victors and claim leaders and best, and under John Beilein in every capacity, in every single way, on the court, off the court, the way that he went about it, the way that he represented the school and his players, the way that his players represented, it truly was leaders and best. Bar none. Best coach in Michigan basketball history and one of the top, I would say, 10 coaches in the last 50 years of Michigan athletics. That's his legacy.
Your associate on your daily show there in Ann Arbor, Zach Shaw from 24/7 Sports, had a stat I heard this week that I really think just sums up what John's accomplished here. I mean, we can go back to 2012. He's won 2 Big Ten championships, 2 Big Ten tournament championships. He's been to 2 national championship games. I mean, that's an incredible run. But when you look at the last 5 years in college basketball, when you combine NBA draft picks with NCAA tournament victories, the only 2 programs that have more of those 2 things combined are Duke and Kentucky. And obviously those programs are operating in a completely different gene pool than John Beilein is operating from. I mean, he's had 6 first-round picks in the NBA draft, and he hasn't recruited a single McDonald's All-American. So when you look at his total legacy, all the things we could point to, I think that one stat may sum it up better than anything else, Michael.
No, I mean, it really, unfortunately for me, Steve, it drives home a point that makes this makes more sense, and that is he's had 6 first-round draft picks without a McDonald's All-American. You tell me any other program in college basketball that has had 6 first-round draft picks in the last decade without a top 30 player in the consensus, the 24/7 Sports composite. Mm-hmm. So he looks around probably programs that he feels he is similar to, Michigan State being one of them, in the ACC, Virginia, maybe in the ACC, not Duke or North Carolina. They're on a different level. But I mean, I think Virginia's the perfect example, mm-hmm. right? And now Virginia's just lost a couple of top players.
Yeah, they've gotten gutted by the NBA draft, actually. Yeah, their top 3 scorers are gone to the NBA, right?
But I mean, it's I don't think anybody, and it reminds you of Michigan hockey. Michigan hockey for about a 6 to 8 year period before Minnesota and Boston College and Boston University and Wisconsin and North Dakota started losing players in mass quantities. Michigan was the one program that year after year was losing guys to the NHL, and it drove Red Berenson almost mad.
Mm-hmm.
And he, I know his career, I don't want to say ended prematurely, but it didn't end the way he wanted it to because of that. And I wonder if John Beilein kind of looked at it and said, you know what, if I do this for 3 or 4 more years, I don't know that I'm going to have the energy. It might drive me insane, and I might just kind of stop. It's hard to fathom that he would ever stop trying, but he might not put the same effort into it that he knew deserved to be the head coach of Michigan. And but you're right, it is an incredible stat. I like to say that I like to think that he's well above the pay grade of a guy named John Calipari, just in terms of the way that he's gone about it and achieved it. I even think that he's done. I think he's more special than Mike Krzyzewski, because I don't think he's had any of the advantages Mike Krzyzewski and Duke has had. It's really quite an elite company that he's in, and honestly, I don't know that there's anybody else in his category.
In many ways, what you're saying, he was a victim of his own success. He developed top 100, top 150 recruits too fast, and made them viable for the NBA draft a full year or sometimes 2 years before even he forecast they could make that jump. And in many respects, he was a victim of his own success. He was almost too good at his job in that regard, Michael.
They left before John Beilein was ready for them to leave.
Mm-hmm.
I think once he got this rolling with, you look at post Stauskas and McGarry, and he recruited a little bit differently, right? He started recruiting guys that were maybe in some ways more of projects, of like the Muhammad Ali Barakmans, the Mo Wagners, DJ Wilson, Xavier Simpson. He started recruiting guys that were more projects, and yet he still got burned by those guys.
Right.
And nothing against them, but if you would have told him you're going to get kind of a half season of DJ Wilson and then 1 full year of DJ Wilson, he would have laughed at you and said, no way, like the guy's not going to be ready to go after 1 full season with me. And if you would have told him, you're going to get a 2 years out of Jordan Poole, but only one of them where he's a starter, he'd say, no, not the case. And you would have said, you get 1 year out of Iggy Brasdeikis. I just don't think he is the type of coach and the type of person that wants to do what Krzyzewski does, and Calipari does, and Bill Self does, and that's constantly recycle players.
Have a new team every year.
That's not who he is.
Yep.
Yeah, he doesn't.
I mean, you go back to the 2015.
You
go back to the 2015 team. That was the one disappointing team he's had. The year that Karis LeVert and Derek Walton both got hurt. Trey Burke, Mitch McGarry, Glenn Robinson Jr., or the third, and Nick Stauskas all still had eligibility. They all could have been on that team in another era, all at the same time.
Yeah,
I think we forget how close we were to seeing a Georgetown in the 1980s kind of a run here. If the old rules of guys sticking around were still in place, whatever impressed you are with the record he has now, imagine if we added the eligibility rules we had in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, what his record would be at Michigan.
The thing about this too, I mean, you just mentioned that class, and Steve, if I've got my math correct here, I believe that because DJ Wilson was a redshirt sophomore when he left after the 2017 season.
Mm-hmm.
So this past year, Michigan went to the Sweet 16 and they lost, but they could have had Moritz Wagner as a stretch 5. They could have had DJ Wilson at the 4.
Yep.
They could have had so much more depth than they did have. And so, yeah, I mean,
let me say one thing, because there's fans of other schools that watch this every week, and they're like, "Hey, we've got big time basketball programs. We have to reload every year." Here's the difference, though.
Right?
We didn't recruit a bunch of McDonald's All-Americans. That's our point. We recruited a lot of guys that were considered. Mitch McGarry was a high level prospect. Glenn Robinson III was by the time his recruitment was done. But none of these guys were McDonald's All-Americans. None of them were expected to be immediate fresh freshman impact, absolute star players like Iggy Brasdeikis, was the leading scorer on the team this year. So in Michigan's case, we were expecting to develop those guys over 3 or 4 years. And that's why I think it's a little bit more unique than the other top programs in the country that deal with this, when they are, going through a different level of recruiting player pool than Michigan is on an annual basis.
No, I think that's precisely it. I mean, imagine if Northwestern football, Pat Fitzgerald, every time he was developing a team,
good analogy.
His best players kept on leaving after 3 years and just entering the NBA or entering the NFL draft. And he had a quarterback, and he had a running back, and he had offensive linemen, and everyone just kept on bolting. And you looked and thought, like, how is this possible? Why is Northwestern, which is not bringing in these top flight guys, constantly losing players? And that's what essentially has happened to John Beilein. And and as he's sitting here and he's looking at the prospects of, can we get Franz Wagner or can we get into the hunt for another grad transfer? And all he has to do is look down the street and see his rival Michigan State and a guy named Tom Izzo who somehow these guys, he gets all the McDonald's All-Americans, and they just keep sticking around for an extra year, another year. Miles Bridges stays for an extra year more than ever thought. Cassius Winston stays through his senior year. Xavier Tillman is a beast in the NCAA tournament. Every guy that's a beast in the NCAA tournament seems to okay, yes, I'm out of here. This is my moment to shine.
Right.
And boom, he says, I'm coming back for a
he doesn't even explore the process, right?
No.
Yeah, I know. I hear you. Let's look then to the future. And, I wrote an article for Wolverine Digest yesterday that didn't go into names. I'm probably going to write something either today or tomorrow that will apply more names to the template, but I think it's important when you're doing a major hire to have your standards first. What's the template you're looking for? Your uncompromising values, your non-negotiables. And then once you have those firmed up, then you start looking at individual names. The first 3 on my list of 4 are pretty obvious. I think you need to have a proven track record as a head coach of being successful. I think you've got to understand at Michigan, you have to have a certain balance between development and recruiting. You can't just go get MAC level players and say we're going to coach them up. You can't do that. On the other hand, though, you have to know even if you hire a Billy Donovan, you're not getting those McDonald's All-Americans because Michigan's never going to play the racketeering game. So you're going to have to recruit a notch, below that. Like we said, the top 100 guys. The third is Michigan, any coach at any sport, football to lacrosse, you got to take the term student athlete seriously. All those 3 are pretty simple, I think. The fourth one is maybe where there might be some disagreement. And that's I said you have to be quote unquote relatively clean. And I think stuff like we're not going to buy Zach Novak on his, one of the players, I can't remember who it was. It was Spike Albrecht. We're not going to buy him an ice cream cone on a visit. I'm going to walk into the summer camps, and when the coaches aren't sitting in the bleachers like they're supposed to, I'm going to point out that's an NCAA violation. I think, frankly, I don't care about any of the NCAA rules. I don't care about covering Laramie Tunsil's poor mother's electric bill. To me, I only care about, because the NCAA doesn't care about its rules either, so why should we? I think there's only 2 things I care about. One, you don't compromise the academic integrity of the institution. That's number 1. And number 2,
you're not North Carolina.
You're right. Number 2, you don't recruit people that are menaces to the safety of the campus population. That's number 2. Barring that, I really don't give. Baylor. Yes, I don't give 2 craps or a stroke how much money they got to go up to test drive a car at Ann Arbor car lot. I don't care, and neither does anybody else. So no one. I mean, to me, I think relatively clean. Like today on the message boards, we're re-prosecuting the Al Horford recruitment to Florida. Why? Why does anybody? Why these aren't illegalities. Helping a poor person's mother pay their electric bill is not, in any other context, would not be considered an immoral, unethical act. So where does this notion that we have to be super ethical to ethical standards that aren't even ethics, let alone prosecuted? Who gives a rip about that stuff?
I'm going to speak out of both sides of my mouth on this one, because I think you asked earlier, what's the legacy of John Beilein? And I think the legacy of John Beilein is that you can compete and win without having to go down that slippery slope. And so to some degree, I understand what you're saying. There are rules in college athletics that I don't care about at all. I would agree with you that, a year ago, Miles Bridges, supposedly his mom had maybe been given $500 here or $500 there. And if that's what we're talking about, then no, I've got no qualms with that. If what we're talking about is buying DeAndre Ayton at Arizona for $100,000,
I totally agree with that. Because here's the thing: do you think Sean Miller reported that on his taxes? Do you think he reported that? Think DeAndre's Ayton reported he got a $10,000 out-of-pocket payment from his coach on his. See what you're talking about is money laundering, tax evasion, racketeering. That's what the FBI scandal probes were about. So I told to me that's not even an NCAA violation. Those are illegalities. But I don't know. Would John Beilein's legacy have been tarnished at all if he had bought Spike Albrecht an ice cream cone on his visit? I don't think so.
No, absolutely not. No, it would not have. So I agree with you. And I think to some, to be successful, I mean, here's what it really comes down to, Steve, when you're asking this question is do you think John Beilein and the way that he won in college basketball, is that something that can be duplicated by the next head coach at the University of Michigan? And even beyond that, how much can it be duplicated across college basketball anywhere? So, some of the names, I mean, someone like, the gentleman's name out of Loyola Chicago, who I'm forgetting at the
Porter
moment.
Moser, who's had one good season in 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you're looking at him going, well, could he come in and do what John Beilein did? I don't know that it exists in college basketball to do what John Beilein did. And I think that is going to be part of his legacy is we might look back in 5 or 10 years and say there is nobody out there winning and competing for conference titles and Sweet 16s on a yearly basis and doing it 100% clean like John Beilein. So if that's the case and it can't be done, then why are we going to hold the next coach to that standard that it has to be done that way? Mm-hmm. I don't want to cheat. I don't want to have the academic problems, and I don't want to have Baylor.
I agree.
But outside of that, I agree with you. If we're talking about, a coach showing up to a school visit and him realizing, you know what, I'm not actually supposed to talk to the kid until
next Tuesday. Yeah. Who cares?
Next Tuesday, yeah.
Who cares?
But I'm running into him.
Yeah.
So be it.
Yeah.
So be it. Because you're right. There's no consequences whatsoever for any of these guys. Will Wade and Sean Miller are not going to end up getting sanctioned by the NCAA. Their schools, Arizona and LSU, may sack these two guys because they don't want to deal with the publicity fallout. But the NCAA ain't touching these guys. And if they're not touching anybody, if they're not touching Krzyzewski, if they're not touching Roy Williams, if they're not touching Bill Self, who's one of the worst offenders of this, if they're not touching any of these guys, I don't know that, the squeaky clean, 100% does everything by the book needs to be part of the criteria for Michigan basketball.
So hire Porter Moser, and then 3 years from now when he's 16 and 14, and they're still charging even more for tickets than you were when Beilein was there. Everybody feel real good about the fact that you didn't get we didn't buy recruits an ice cream cone or violate the no contact period discount. You didn't get that. Yeah. Something tells me the shirts will still, the M shirts will still cost just as much money at the damn M Den when you're 16 and 14 with Porter or Moser than they would be if you were 32 and 5 with Billy Donovan. This is ridiculousness. And to me, we ought to regulate this like Germany regulates the Autobahn. And that is, there are no rules until you use a motor vehicle in a way that endangers somebody else, and then it's a zero tolerance policy. Okay, so here are the two rules. Don't bastardize student athlete. Don't damage the academic integrity of the institution. Don't be a menace to the campus population. Other than that, and if you do those things, everybody's fired, zero tolerance, no apologies, and we don't make any excuses. Short of that, go win, because that's what you're here to do, is to win. Within those two rules. Those would be the only two rules that I have. So go ahead.
I think that makes sense. And I tell you, it's interesting to me. every fan base is guilty of this, and we talked about this on my show on Tuesday. Every fan base kind of has a pie-in-the-sky idea of what their institution is and who they're going to get, and that changed. That changed about 5 to 8 years ago, Steve, and you know this, when more and more of these schools, and they especially in the Big Ten and the SEC network, the Big Ten network were created, and these schools started getting their $40-50 million payouts per year from their conference TV networks. Because what happened in college sports is the difference between the have and have-nots in recruiting still exists, but the difference between the have and have-nots in coaches' salaries has shrunk. And while there are some outliers like Clemson's Dabo Swinney making $9.3 million per year, and Jim Harbaugh making north of $7 million, and Nick Saban making close to $10 million, is if you look at someone like Mark Few at Gonzaga, we had this conversation after our show ended today. Why would Mark Few at Gonzaga not entertain the idea of going to Michigan? They could pay him $3.5-4 million, but you know what? He makes $1.7 million right now.
I was just in Spokane, Washington last summer, speaking out there. Beautiful country, and you can $1.7 million goes a hell of a long way in Spokane, Washington. Yeah,
and that's the thing is none of these coaches, when you used to have a program like UCLA becomes a head coaching vacancy like they had this offseason. They took forever to fill that role with Mick Cronin from Cincinnati. One of the reasons why it takes forever is because the mid-majors are paying their coaches $1 million, and the smaller schools in the Power 5 conferences are all paying their coaches $2 million. And so you're not getting this tremendous payday to go to Michigan, go to Ohio State, go to UCLA, go to, Indiana, some of the big name schools that have been available the last couple of years. And so you can't just go out there and pluck anybody you want anymore. And so that's really kind of changed the game. But so there is the pie in the sky type guys, Brad Stevens, maybe Mark Few is a pie in the sky, but there's some really intriguing names to me too. And I do think that Billy Donovan, the former Florida coach, now at Oklahoma City, I've now heard two reports from people I trust that, he could be a good fit for Michigan. And I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't go look at him, why we shouldn't go take a chance with him. And I don't think there's any reason why Michigan has to settle for a Porter Moser from Loyola Chicago. If that's where this ends up, if they end up with Porter or they end up with Lavelle Jordan, I'm going to look at Ward Manuel and I'm going to think you failed in your first big-time responsibility as AD at Michigan.
I completely agree. Two things that I'll let you go. One, are you a Godfather guy? Okay.
I am a Godfather guy.
Then you'll get the reference I'm about to make. See, the old college basketball cheating, the violating of no contact rules, paying a recruit's mom's electric bill, dad's bail money, car payment, the stuff we used to find a job for a family member on campus, that was kind of the old Vito Corleone mob. And they provided prostitution and liquor, and if the beat cops wanted to stop there after a stressful day on the job of nearly losing their lives and let some steam off and then go home to their wives and kids, they almost considered it a public service. That's the way they kind of looked at it, and that's the way that the old college cheating coaches used to look at it, which is, hey, we're taking care of poor kids, we're not the bad guy here, right? That's how they used to look at it. And then a guy named Salazzo shows up one day and says, we're going to start selling smack in these neighborhoods because that's where the real money's at. And the old guard, Vito, and those guys said, wait a minute. Hey, brothels and speakeasies are one thing, but you start dropping, narcotics, we're going to turn this is going to be generations. We're going to create zombies. We're going to ruin our communities. We're all making enough money. We don't need to do that. Plus, the cops won't go along with us like they will with women and booze. They'll turn on us. The cops will become our enemies. It's too risky. We're not going to do that. Why do I use that analogy? That's what's happened in college basketball. What Sean Miller and Will Wade and these guys are doing is getting on wiretaps and saying, quote, that's a strong-ass offer. Having one of your assistant coaches saying that you're paying another player out of your own pocket 10 freaking grand a month. See, this is the kind of stuff now that a lot of other coaches that were willing to look the other way to get their jobs done because they could justify it as, hey, I'm helping a poor kid too. They're now like, wait a minute, man. That's way beyond what I originally signed up for. Okay, I'm not a freaking pimp. That's not what I got into this for. And I could see there being several coaches at power schools that if Michigan and their search committee comes to them and says, we are the only top, we'll even be conservative and say, we're the only top 20 job in America that you know right now you can win at and not have to do anything that requires a Silkwood shower when it's over. And our fan base loves the team, but it's more of a football school. So if you don't get past the Sweet 16 in 4 or 5 years, they don't lose their bowels like they do at the other top 20 schools. Do you want this job for $5 million a year? I think the prospect of doing this at a national university where maybe you were comfortable with a certain amount of skullduggery, but now we're getting into flat out freaking racketeering and money laundering. I could see a lot of, like a Mike White at a Florida, a chance for him to get out of the SEC grinder and be like, I can do this at a national school and not have to, feel like I literally have to, go into a detoxification chamber after every meeting with a booster. I'm in. I think Michigan fans are underestimating that kind of being the zig when everybody else is the zag actually can be a selling point. Michael, your thoughts?
No, I mean, honestly, I agree with all of that. I do think that it could be really appealing. I just wonder who that coach is that takes that, because I still don't think you're probably going to pull, a Tony Bennett away after he just won a national title, because he can kind of do that at Virginia. The Iowa State.
Kenny, he's done it for a few years now. But here's the thing: Duke and North Carolina are still sitting there. We don't have any schools like that. You and I may not like some of the things we know Ohio State polls. It's nothing compared to what those schools are doing. Nothing.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. I guess I'd be shocked by Tony Bennett at the same time he did just get gutted and lost his 3 top scorers, and maybe he looks at the Big Ten and says, look, I won. I can leave at Virginia on top. I won a legacy. I have a legacy here. I don't need to prove anything to these people anymore. It'll be interesting. Again, if I'm Ward Manuel, I'm stepping up into the cleanup spot, and I'm looking for fastballs, and I'm swinging for the fences.
Agreed.
And if I end up with a bunt single here to break up the no-no, to stick with our silly baseball reference, I'm not impressed. I'm not impressed. And you have a platform, and I have a platform, and certainly I'll give the head coach whoever he hires, I'll give him a thorough, glance over and really investigate and take a look and see who this guy is. But if you have to go to plan C right now, then that's going to say a lot about who Ward Manuel is as an athletic director. Because I'll say this: I've heard a lot of people say, well, the timing's not good, and no coach is going to want to leave their program and leave it in that state. Are you kidding me? Are you absolutely kidding me that no coach? I mean, look at Manny Diaz. He gets a job, and literally like a week later, Miami Hurricanes call him up and say, hey, would you be willing to leave Temple to come to and he says, absolutely, I'm there in a heartbeat. And so if you're a coach who wants to compete at the highest level, and Michigan calls you up in mid-May and says, hey, I know that it's, the recruiting season and all that stuff, and it's not a perfect place, but here's a $4.5 million deal to compete for Big Ten championships and compete for a national title and do it the right way. He's going to say, no, it's just the timing's not right. Why don't you call me again in a year? God, what a stupid argument that is.
Yes. Final question. Our next taping is May 29th. I think Michigan will absolutely have its next basketball coach. Yeah, I think they absolutely will.
Yeah. They have to. They have to. I understand getting it right. But you remember when Lloyd stepped away, and it was about Lloyd stepped away in the last what was it, the last game, after the last game of the season against
right after Ohio State. Right.
And it was about, I want to say almost 3 weeks before they hired Rich Rodriguez. And, the Les Miles thing turned out to be a debacle. And then there was talk about Kirk Ferentz. And, God, Kirk Ferentz would have been a godsend compared to, they had other names out there like
Pat Fitzgerald.
Guy from Rutgers at the time.
Yeah.
Pat Schiano and Pat Fitzgerald.
Mm-hmm.
And, it just became, Michigan became this public nightmare, or this public joke. Everybody was laughing at Bill Martin. He couldn't find someone to come to Michigan. And look what happened to UCLA as they, spun their wheels trying to find a new coach. You don't want to do that. You can't lose that type of momentum. You can't become the program that people make fun of. And so if you go in to stretch this into June, you're past Memorial Day weekend, and you've been operating for 3-4 weeks without head coach. Now we're in a serious point of contention and problem for Ward Manuel. So May 29th is the next time you tape. God help us, Steve. We need to have a basketball coach by then.
Michael, great discussion. Thanks for joining us this week on Michigan Podcast. Go Blue, brother.
My pleasure.
All right, take care. So there it is. We asked you on our Twitter poll this week, Michigan football's win total has been set for this fall at 9.5. Are you taking the over or the under? 76% of you are taking the over, 24% of you taking the under. I would be on the over. I think there's a much better chance Michigan goes 10-2 with the team it has returning than it goes 9-3 or worse. Let's take a look at this week's question of the week. It's from Shane Westwood, who says, hey, man, loving you guys' content. Just curious, which do you think is more likely for this football team? Number 1, losing to MSU, or number 2, beating Ohio State? In other words, which will be larger, MSU stepping forward or Ohio State stepping back? Well, I think you have to say it's just looking at the odds. I mean, if you look at past history, it's far more likely that Ohio State or Michigan would lose to Ohio State or Michigan State than beat Ohio State. This year, though, I'm not sure that's the case. And you kind of are asking yourself, if they don't beat Ohio State this year, then like when will they ever do it, like ever again? And if you look at the history of rivalries, by the way, it almost seems like when they get to that point is usually when they turn. Army-Navy in the last few years is a great example. It didn't feel like Army was ever going to beat Navy again. Now I think they've won, 2 or 3 in a row. So that's how a lot of classic rivalries work. USC had Notre Dame's number for the longest time. Notre Dame's now won a few in a row in that rivalry too. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, last offseason, I told you that I thought Michigan State was overrated. They had a lot of their starters back, and that was good. But when I looked at their overall depth, I thought they were clearly behind the other top teams in the Big Ten East. And if they suffered, a rash of injuries, I didn't think they had the depth to survive. And I turned out to be right about that. They did have too many injuries last season, and their depth just wasn't there. This year, I think Michigan State is underrated. I think they've had now another full class to recruit. I mean, their depth was impacted by the disaster that was the 2016 class, where a lot of those guys were kicked out of school and really decimated that recruiting class and the depth that they had to have from that class. They've now had another full year to recruit past that class. So I think Michigan State's going to be better than people think. I think they'll be much more in the 8-4, 9-3 variety. But I think with the way things are setting up for Michigan, it kind of reminds me of the year John Cooper finally got off the schneid against Michigan in 1998, where he kind of had everybody back, had Michigan at home, and they won that game. And it kind of feels like there's a similar vibe heading into this year for the Wolverines, but we shall see. I mean, we have invented ways to lose to Ohio State for the better part of a decade and a half. So I don't know that you can get too confident about them coming up with a way to win one of these until you actually see them do it. That's going to do it for this week's edition of Michigan Podcast. Don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. You can keep up with us online in between episodes every day at WolverineDigest.com. That's WolverineDigest.com. If you listen to us on any podcast platform, would you mind leaving us a 5-star review? We would appreciate that, and thank all of you that have done that for us already. And a special shout out to our friends at Detroit Sports Podcast for helping us get the word out about this show each and every episode. Until next time, go Blue.